Hey everybody, this is Angel. You're watching ASMR Angel Reads. I think for my YouTube picture, whatever you call it, that shows up on your videos, I think I'm going to do Snapchat filters for my face, just because they're fun. Anyway, we're still reading Daggerspell Chapter 5. Sorry it's been so long since I read again, but I've just been really busy. So, last time we read Jill and Cullen and I think Rodri were meeting Nevin through Adern, his old pupil. And they're talking about how they can catch Lotta Lane, who's a rebel Westfolk. So anyway, we'll continue on. Oh, and it looks like Laudelin's actually Adern's son, so he's half elf and half human. While he swilled a wooden cup of ale, Lord Corbin watched Laudelane with the devotion of a well-trained dog. Raven-haired, blue-eyed, Corbin had once been a good-looking man, but now his eyes were puffy and his cheeks mottled with fine red lines. Laudelin hated him, but he was a necessary tool since he had reasons of his own to want Rodri Mailweed dead. The darkness voice had promised Laudelane that if Rodri died, soon men and elves would kill each other all down the border. Laudelane gloated over the promise like a jewel. As soon as the men finished the noon meal, Corbin was saying, "We'll be on our way and after him. They'll be moving slower now than they have their supply train." Laudelin started to reply, but the darkness swirled out of nowhere and enveloped his mind. It was the first time that it had come unbidden, and Laudelin was terrified. "Fear not, I'm your friend, and I've come to warn you. Someone has been spying on you. Someone breached your astral seal. Beware, stay on guard." The voice in the darkness disappeared so fast that Corbin apparently hadn't noticed anything. "Does that plan suit you, counselor?" he said. "It does." Abruptly, Laudelane rose and shoved his hands into his brigha pockets to hide their shaking. "I know I can always trust you in matters of war." Without another word, he stalked off, leaving Corbin puzzled behind him, and walked to the edge of the area covered by the astral dome. Yet he was too shaken to check his various seals. For the first time it occurred to him to wonder just who it was who spoke to him in the darkness. Sitting packed in together, standing along the walls, drinking ale and talking in a sea roar of laughter and jest, 187 men crammed into Duncannabane's great hall. 50 of them were the fort guard, and Sligan had left. 50 of them were the fort guard that Sligan had left behind, but the rest rode for the three lords sitting with Lovian at the honor table. Edar, Comer, and Guirin. Lovian had Edar, Comer, and Guirin. Lovian had never doubted Edar's loyalty for a minute, but she had been pleasantly surprised when the other two had shown up at her gates. The servants bustled around to clear away the food from the noon meal and serve meat all around. Edar, a blond, beaky man in his 20s, finally said aloud what they'd all been thinking. "If Kenneth isn't here by now, your grace, then he isn't joining the muster. And that goes for Domric and Sinven, too." "So it does," Lovian said. "Well, Sinven has the smallest warband in the run. Let him go over for all I care." The lords grinned and saluted her with their goblets. Caradoc ran to the table with the young silver dagger in tow. "Messages, my lady, from Lord Rodri." The silver dagger knelt and drew the message out of his shirt. As she took them, Lovian noticed his smooth face and wondered just how young he could have earned this ill-omened dagger. Caro, take this lad over to the men and get him some food, then fetch it the scribe. Although Lovian was perfectly capable of reading the message herself, it would have hurt the scribe's feelings. He snappily shook out the rolled parchment and cleared his throat several times as the lords leaned onto the table to listen. Rodri described in terse detail the battle at the ruined Dun, then ordered the reinforcements to ride northwest to meet him. He was making for a little tributary of the Brog while he tried to circle round Corbin's army. With a clatter of chairs being shoved back and the jingle of swords at their side, the lords rose to do his bidding. The scribe leaned over and whispered, "A private note at the end, your grace, from Nevin." Lovian snatched the parchment. "My dear Lovian," the note ran, "although the situation is grave, I have cause for hope. Our Dwemer enemy is so daft that it's marvel he presents any threat at all. Adern and I will keep Rodri safe, I'll wager. May I beg you for a boon? The silver dagger who wrote this message is not the lad she seems, but a lass, and someone dear to me. Would you give her a proper shelter, your humble servant, Nevin?" "Oh, by the gods," Lovian laughed aloud. "Caro, run and fetch the silver dagger to me. Tell her to bring her meal and finish it here." "Her, your grace?" "Just that. I must be going blind or such like." When the silver dagger brought her trenches of bread and meat to the table, Lovian could see that indeed she was a female, and quite pretty at that. She introduced herself as Jill, the daughter of Cullen of Cremor. "Well, isn't this interesting? So you're the daughter of a famous man. Have you known Nevin long, child?" "Only a few days, your grace, but truly I never met a man I liked more for all of his Dwemer. I felt much the same when first we met. Now finish your meal. After we see the warband off, we'll get you a bath and find you a chamber up in the women's quarters." When they came out to the ward, the riders were already bringing their horses into line, and the carters were hitching their teams to the carts. Every lord in the Tiran owed Lovian his full provisioned warband for 40 days a year, and not one day more. Her heart was heavy as she wondered if Corbin would make the war drag on beyond that just so she would have to pay the lords to serve longer. Sligan, of course, would fight at his own expense for as long as necessary. She doubted the others even thought that they gathered around her with every show of respect. "Until you join up with Rodri, my lords," Lovian said, "Eddar will be your Cadvarok." "My thanks for your honor, your grace," Eddar said with a bow. "I'll send a man back with a message as soon as we found them. Let's hope it's quick." "Indeed, may the gods ride with you." Lovian and Jill stood in the doorway of the Brock and watched as the army slowly got itself into a line and marched and filed out of the gates of the Dun. If you've been riding with your father, you must have seen this many a time." "I have, your grace, and every time I'm half sick with fear, wondering if I'll see Da again." Lovian was suddenly struck by what life would be like out on the roads with no family to turn to if her father were slain. It gave her a sick feeling. No matter what had happened to her husband, she herself would always have been safe, an important member of her vast clan. She caught Jill's filthy hand and squeezed it. "Well, here, child, you've come to a safe place now. For Nevin's sake alone, I'd offer you my shelter, but I'd be a poor excuse for a noble-born woman if I couldn't care for the orphan of a man who died in my services. No matter what happens, you'll have a place in my retinue." Jill started shaking, a little tremor of her whole body. "Your grace is truly most generous, lord, I've ever met. If you ever need my sword, then it is at your disposal." It was such a masculine way of thanking someone that Lovian nearly laughed. "Let's pray things never come to that, but you have my thanks." "So Corbin's taking the bait," Rodri said. He is, Nevin said. I found the army further east than I expected. They're angling around to follow you, sure enough. Splendid. Roderick glanced up at the sun. About 3 hours after noon. What of the men from Canabane? They're on their way. Adern can tell your messenger exactly where to find them. I'll detail a man straight away. My thanks. After the messenger rode off, Rodri led the army a bit further east and then decided to make camp and wait for reinforcements, who, according to Adern, were riding fast and letting their provisions follow. Rodri felt profoundly ungrateful, but he thought to himself that all this Dwemer aid, as useful as it was a cursed, unsettling thing to have around you. The rest of the noble lords agreed. When just at nightfall Eddard rode in, he was swearing in amazement at the ease with which the messenger had found the reinforcing army. At first I thought it was some trick of Coben's, Eddard said, but Comer recognized your man. Well, there's somewhat odd afoot. Come have somewhat to eat and I'll tell you about it. As the noble-born sat around a campfire together and shared a meal, Rodri had the unpleasant job of convincing still more of his allies that the rumors of Dwemer were true and twice true. With Sligan on his side, the job was easier because no one had ever seen Sligan give in to the slightest touch of whimsy or fancy. For a long time they sat in silence, the noble-born as crowded as their men. Rodri wondered why none of them, and he included himself in this, were comforted by the knowledge that they had Dwemer on their side. Finally he realized that they all felt insignificant, merely playing stones in a game board of Dwemer's choosing. For weeks Rodri had thought of himself as the focus of the rebellion and his death as its goal. Now he'd become the only pebble set down as one small move in a war between Adern and Laudelane. That night, long after the others had gone to their tents, Rodri walked down to the banks of the stream. In the light from the stars and the waning moon, he could see quite well, an odd talent that he had since childhood, but he kept it strictly to himself. Out on the meadows surrounding the sleeping camp, guards prowled back and forth on the watch. The stream itself ran silver flecked with foam as it chuckled over the rocks. All day Rodri had been troubled by the premonition, and now it clung to him with cold arms. Something was going to happen to him, something important and irrevocable. And for a warrior, there was only one thing that something could be. He didn't want to die. It seemed wretchedly unfair that he was going to die, when all his death would mean was Laudelane had jumped one of Adern's stones and taken it off the board. When he heard someone moving behind him, he swirled, his sword half drawn, but it was only Cullen stumbling a bit in the darkness. I just wondered who was out here, my lord. It's my turn on watch, you see. Is something wrong? Not. I was just thinking of Carnock. Ever play that game, Silver Dagger? Oh, every now and then, my lord. There's not much challenge in it. You think so, do you? Well, then that's the war. Well, then, when this war's over, we'll have to sit down and play, and you can teach me what you know. Cullen smiled briefly, as if he were wondering if they'd live to sit down at a board together. Rodri felt premonition again as a clench of his stomach. Something irrevocable was about to happen, something that had guided his whole life here, to this moment, and to Cullen of Cremor. I'd best get back to my post, my lord. So you'd better. Here, Cullen. Tomorrow, on the line of the march, you come ride beside me. What? Here, that's too big of an honor for a dishonored man like me. By the hells, it's not. Have any of the noble-born made me an offer to stick close to me in the fighting? You ride with me and you eat with me, too. It was later the same night that Nevin felt the Dwemer warning, a cold, clammy prickling down his back that brought him suddenly and completely awake. His first thought was that Corbin might be riding to make a night strike on the camp, and he crossed his arms over his chest and went into a trance in order to do a little scouting. In his body of light he soared up high over the camp, dimly glowing from the indrawn auras of the sleeping men. Above him in the dark blue light, the night was etheric. The stars blazed, great silver orbs of pure energy. He could see far, but nothing moved in the meadow or woodland except a few deer off to the horizon. If the danger wasn't from Corbin, it might well be from Lottelaine. Nevin turned his attention to the etheric and saw far above him a tiny shape like an insulated rogue on fire. Nevin knew that Lottelaine had been trained to assume the elven-style body of light, a huge silver flame as opposed to a human-shaped form. With a grim little smile, Nevin darted up fast, but the flame shape fled, rushing away through the eddying currents of the blue light. Nevin might have caught him, but he saw a more curious prize. Shadowing Lottelaine at a long distance was one of the wild folks, a peculiarly bent nexus of dark lines and a dim glow. Nevin summoned the light and made a silver net woven of the malleable etheric substance, then swooped after the creature. In the exhalation of terror, it fled from him, but Nevin caught upon his own wild folk who swarmed around, jostling it, shoving it back, thrusting it finally out of the swarm. Then he could net it easily. Swelling, flashing, it struggled against the lines of force, but the net held and he hauled it in like a fish. Now came the trick. With the struggling wild folk firmly in hand, Nevin floated back to his body. He hovered above it, fought the pull of the flesh, stayed fully conscious as he slipped back in. The fight was painful. Rather than merely lapsing back into a normal consciousness, he felt the meddling in every bone and vein as he took up his residence in his body again. Yet, in spite of the pain, he kept the etheric net tight and brought at last the captured wild folk back with him. Nevin sat up and found a very peculiar prize indeed struggling in his hands. On the physical plane it was a gnome of sorts, but even more deformed and ugly than usual. Twisted, shrunken shoulders, stubby legs, enormous hands, and a snarling, warty face with tiny eyes and long fangs. Someone's shaped you, hasn't he? Someone's worked a strange magic indeed upon you. Paralyzed with terror, the gnome went limp in his hands. Nevin let his feelings flow out to it, a deep pity, a sympathy, in fact, a kind of love for the creature deformed against its will. When he released it, the gnome threw itself against his chest. "You're safe now. You'll never have to go back to your master again. Was your master Lottelaine?" The gnome looked up and shook his head no. "Indeed, how very interesting. Come with me, little brother. I'm going to summon your king here, and on this plane I think it might be safer all around." With the gnome riding on his shoulder, Nevin left the sleeping camp and went a good ways away where he could sit down and work in private. In his mind he built up a flaming pentagram of blue light, then pushed the image out until it seemed to stand in front of him, a glowing star some 6 feet high. The gnome saw it too and stood transfixed as Nevin slowly chanted the secret names of the kings of the element of earth. The space inside the star changed into a silver swirl of pale light, light the sort that never shone on land or sea, and in that light appeared a figure, vaguely elven, yet glowing so brightly that its form was hard to discern. "One of my kind has tormented this little brother," Nevin said aloud. "Will you take him into your charge?" The voice came back within his mind. "I will, and my thanks, master of the fifth of us, master of the ethereal." When the figure held out a pale glowing hand, the gnome ran into it and threw himself into the sanctuary of the king. The silver light disappeared. There was only a blue star which Nevin methodically banished. He stood up and stamped thrice on the ground to end the working. "As our Colin would say," Nevin remarked to the night wind, "oh, horse shit and a pail of it." Nevin hurried back to camp to wake Addern. He knew that the only master of Dark Dwemer could have deformed the gnome in that particular way. This dark master was in for a shock, too, when his little messenger never returned. The question was, why would the Dark Dreamer be spying on Laudeline? That's about it for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.